one of the things I've noticed recently, which has changed from the development perspective than it used to be, say, 5 or 10 years ago, is more and more you get presented with a story. You know, someone says, well, you know, we work on the story together. And the question starts to arise, well, what is this? In the 5 years ago, I would be sent a project and it would be, well, this is a TV series, or this is a feature film. This is, you know, an online series. And there was never a discussion at that point, okay, well, what if it wasn't? What if it was something else? The notion of what a story is becoming, from the development perspective, from someone who's working in it every day, is becoming much more fluid. That people understand that the story that they're working on has possible manifestations in different ways. And the idea that this is a feature film from the start is something that many of the projects I work on are exactly that. They are a feature film, they are a series. But more and more, you start to see projects where people are beginning to say, well, what is it exactly? And they're working on the story without necessarily making the commitment at that stage that this is this kind of a story. So, and this is particularly true of younger writers and directors and producers, that the notion of where the story appears, where it goes and what it is becoming much more fluid and flexible. And I think that's because as the evolution of digital technology goes on, as our world is more and more evolving in terms of different kinds of media and different kinds of ways you can access stories, that people are beginning to think of stories in a much more complex and fluid way. Now, the question I would then ask is, what are the implications of that change, which I think is coming, I think it's already here, and I think it's going to get bigger and faster. What are the implications of that for the people who are involved in the business of making stories? You know, and more specifically for me, what are the implications for the process of development? So I'm not necessarily talking about, you know, distribution or the various places the story will end up. How do you develop a story if the idea of where the story is going to be is not as set or defined as it used to be? So what processes do you use? How do you do that? But one of the things that occurs to me, which is what S2M was kind of the original idea of it, is that, well, if stories are much more fluid and we don't necessarily have to make a decision as early as we used to about where the story goes, then maybe in that development process, you need to bring into that process people who are much more experienced and knowledgeable about the various places a story can go. And then the question is, if you do that, how does that change the process of development? And how does that inhibit the writer? Does the writer start to go, hang on a second, I don't want to have to think about, you know, where the story goes. I don't want to think about marketing ideas. This is not what I am. Or do they learn things from that conversation that will help them develop and evolve their projects? Now, I want to say very quickly that I don't think this is something that, if someone wants to make a feature film and that's what they want to make, a writer or director, you know, I'm not saying, oh, you have to do something else. But I do think very seriously that I keep thinking about 2006, 15 years ago, and I think about how the world was then, and how I understood things, and now I'm thinking about 2036, in 15 years' time. The only thing I know about 2036, based on my understanding of 2006, is the way that we do things is going to be very, very different. And our audiences are evolving and changing very quickly, and their knowledge and understanding of how to access stories and the technological capacity to do that is also changing very quickly. So we're not going to be doing what we do now in 15 years the way we do it now. Okay, I don't know how we're going to be doing it, but I know it's going to be different. And so partly what I'm interested in, or we're interested in, is saying, well, how do we affect and explore that difference? You know, how do we, together as a community of creative and business people, how do we find the ways of understanding how these things might work? What I've done in the past few years myself is work with filmmakers and ask them questions about how you conceive of the idea of your story. Okay, so I say, for example, what if you thought about how the story was distributed before you knew what the story was? What if you thought about how you would sell the story before you knew what the story was, rather than saying, I have a story, now how do I sell it? Now, the thing I would point out is that when you do development, when you do, for example, a treatment or a synopsis or an outline, this is a marketing process. You have an idea and you have to sell it to someone. If you're a writer, you have to sell the idea to a producer. The writing of a treatment or an outline is a marketing exercise. It's a creative exercise, but you are always selling. Because you have to sell the story to your producer. The producer goes, this is fantastic, let's do it. Okay, so you have to sell the idea. You're always selling. So if someone on the creative side says, oh, selling is, it's difficult for me to get my head around, it seems foreign to what I do, you sell all the time. Pitching is selling, discussing a story is selling. It's part of the process of creating.